Summary of events during the master's second absence. Of the heavy sickness which declared itself next morning, I can think with equanimity, as of the last unmingled trouble that befell my master; and even that was perhaps a mercy in disguise, for what pains of the body could equal the miseries of his mind? Mrs. Henry and I had the watching by the bed. My old lord called from time to time to take the news, but would not usually pass the door. Once, I remember, when hope was nigh gone, he stepped to the bedside, looked a while in his son's face, and turned away with a singular gesture of the head and hand thrown up, that remains upon my mind as something tragic. Such grief and such a scorn of sublunary things were there expressed. But the most of the time Mrs. Henry and I had the room to ourselves, taking turns by night, and bearing each other company by day, for it was dreary watching. Mr. Henry, his shaven head bound in a napkin, tossed to and fro without remission, beating the bed with his hands. His tongue never lay, his voice ran continuously like a river, so that my heart was weary with the sound of it. It was notable, and to me inexpressibly mortifying, that he spoke all the while on matters of no import, comings and goings, horses, which he was ever calling to have saddled, thinking perhaps, the poor soul, that he might ride away from his discomfort, matters of the garden, the salmon nets, and, what I particularly raged to hear, continually of his affairs, ciphering figures, and holding disputation with the tenantry. Never a word of his father or his wife, nor of the master, save only for a day or two, when his mind dwelled entirely in the past, and he supposed himself a boy again, and upon some innocent child's play with his brother. What made this the more affecting? It appeared the master had then run some peril of his life, for there was a cry, "Oh, Jamie will be drowned! Oh, save Jamie!" which he came over and over with a great deal of passion. This, I say, was affecting both to Mrs. Henry and myself; but the balance of my master's wanderings did him little justice. It seemed he had set out to justify his brother's calumnies, as though he was bent to prove himself a man of a dry nature, immersed in money-getting. Had I been there alone, I would not have troubled my thumb. But all the while, as I listened, I was estimating the effect on the man's wife, and telling myself that he fell lower every day. I was the one person on the surface of the globe that comprehended him, and I was bound there should be yet another. Whether he was to die there, and his virtues perish, or whether he should save his days, and come back to that inheritance of sorrows, his right memory, I was bound he should be heartily lamented in the one case, and unaffectedly welcomed in the other, by the person he loved the most, his wife. Finding no occasion of free speech, I bethought me at last of a kind of documentary disclosure; and for some nights, when I was off duty, and should have been asleep, I gave my time to the preparation of that which I may call my budget. But this I found to be the easiest portion of my task, and that which remained, namely the presentation to my lady, almost more than I had fortitude to overtake. Several days I went about with my papers under my arm, spying for some juncture of talk to serve as introduction. I will not deny but that some offered, only when they did, my tongue clove to the roof of my mouth, and I think I might have been carrying about my packet till this day, had not a fortunate accident delivered me from all my hesitations. This was at night, when I was once more leaving the room, the thing not yet done, and myself in despair at my own cowardice. "What do you carry about with you, Mr. Mackellar?" she asked. "These last days I see you always coming in and out with the same armful." I returned upon my steps without a word, laid the papers before her on the table, and left her to her reading. Of what that was, I am now to give you some idea, and the best will be to reproduce a letter of my own which came first in the budget, and of which according to an excellent habitude, I have preserved the scroll. It will show, too, the moderation of my part in these affairs, a thing which some have called recklessly in question. Durrisdeer, 1757. Honoured Madam, I trust I would not step out of my place without occasion, but I see how much evil has flowed in the past to all of your noble house from that unhappy and secretive fault of reticency, and the papers on which I venture to call your attention are family papers, and all highly worthy your acquaintance. I append a schedule with some necessary observations, and am, honoured Madam, your ladyship's obliged, obedient servant, Ephraim Mackellar. Schedule of papers. A. Scroll of 10 letters from Ephraim Mackellar to the Honourable James Dury, Esquire, by courtesy Master Ballantrae, during the latter's residence in Paris, under dates, follow the dates, nota, to be read in connection with B and C. B. 7 original letters from the said Master of Ballantrae to the said E. Mackellar, under dates, follow the dates. C. 3 original letters from the said Master of Ballantrae to the Honourable Henry Dury, Esquire, under dates, follow the dates, nota, given me by Mr. Henry to answer. Copies of my answers, A4, A5, and A9 of these productions. The purport of Mr. Henry's communications, of which I can find no scroll, may be gathered from those of his unnatural brother. D. A correspondence, original and scroll, extending over a period of 3 years, till January of the current year, between the said Master of Ballantrae and Under Secretary of State, 27 in all. Nota, found among the Master's papers. Weary as I was with watching and distress of mind, it was impossible for me to sleep. All night long I walked in my chamber, revolving what should be the issue, and sometimes repenting the temerity of my immixture in affairs so private. And with the first peep of the morning I was at the sick-room door. Mrs. Henry had thrown open the shutters and even the window, for the temperature was mild. She looked steadfastly before her, where was nothing to see, or only the blue of the morning creeping among woods. Upon the stir of my entrance she did not so much as turn about her face, a circumstance from which I augured very ill. "Madam," I began, and then again, "Madam," but could make no more of it. Nor yet did Mrs. Henry come to my assistance with a word. In this pass I began gathering up the papers where they lay scattered on the table, and the first thing that struck me, their bulk appeared to have diminished. Once I ran them through, and twice; but the correspondence with the Secretary of State, on which I had reckoned so much against the future, was nowhere to be found. I looked in the chimney. Amid the smouldering embers, black ashes of paper fluttered in the draught, and at that my timidity vanished. "Good God, madam!" cried I, in a voice not fitting for a sick-room. "Good God, madam, what have you done with my papers?" "I have burned them," said Mrs. Henry, turning about. "It is enough, it is too much, that you and I have seen them." "This is a fine night's work that you have done," cried I, "and all to save the reputation of a man that ate bread by the shedding of his comrades' blood, as I do by the shedding of ink." "To save the reputation of that family in which you are a servant, Mr. Mackellar," she returned, "and for which you have already done so much." "It is a family I will not serve much longer," I cried, "for I am driven desperate. You have stricken the sword out of my hands. You have left us all defenceless. I had always these letters I could shake over his head, and now what is to do? We are so falsely situate, we dare not show the man the door. The country would fly on fire against us. And I had this one hold upon him, and now it is gone. Now he may come back to-morrow, and we must all sit down with him to dinner, go for a stroll with him on the terrace, or take a hand at cards, of all things, to divert his leisure. No, madam, God forgive you, if he can find it in his heart, for I cannot find it in mine." "I wonder to find you so simple, Mr. Mackellar," said Mrs. Henry. "What does this man value reputation? But he knows how high we prize it. He knows we would rather die than make these letters public. And do you suppose he would not trade upon the knowledge? What you call your sword, Mr. Mackellar, and which had been one indeed against a man of any remnant of propriety, would have been but a sword of paper against him. He would smile in your face at such a threat. He stands upon his degradation. He makes that his strength. It is in vain to struggle with such characters." She cried out this last a little desperately, and then with more quiet. "No, Mr. Mackellar, I have thought upon this matter all night, and there is no way out of it. Papers or no papers, the door of this house stands open for him. He is the rightful heir, forsooth. If we sought to exclude him, all would redound against poor Henry, and I should see him stoned again upon the streets. Ah, if Henry dies, it is a different matter. They have broke the entail for their own good purposes. The estate goes to my daughter, and I shall see who sets a foot upon it. But if Henry lives, my poor Mr. Mackellar, and that man returns, we must suffer. Only this time it will be together." On the whole, I was well pleased with Mrs. Henry's attitude of mind, nor could I even deny there was some cogency in that which he advanced about the papers. "Let us say no more about it," said I. "I can only be sorry I trusted a lady with the originals, which was an unbusinesslike proceeding at the best. As for what I said of leaving the service of the family, it was spoken with the tongue only, and you may set your mind at rest. I belong to Durrisdeer, Mrs. Henry, as if I had been born there." I must do her the justice to say she seemed perfectly relieved, so that we began this morning, as we were to continue for so many years, on a proper ground of mutual indulgence and respect. The same day, which was certainly predicate to joy, we observed the first signal recovery in Mr. Henry, and about 3 of the following afternoon he found his mind again, recognizing me by name, with the strongest evidences of affection. Mrs. Henry was also in the room at the bed-foot, but it did not appear that he observed her; and indeed, the fever being gone, he was so weak that he made but the one effort, and sank again into a lethargy. The course of his restoration was now slow but equal. Every day his appetite improved. Every week we were able to remark an increase both of strength and flesh. And before the end of the month he was out of bed, and had even begun to be carried in his chair upon the terrace. It was perhaps at this time that Mrs. Henry and I were the most uneasy in mind. Apprehension for his days was at an end, and a worse fear succeeded. Every day we drew consciously nearer to a day of reckoning, and the days passed on, and still there was nothing. Mr. Henry bettered in strength. He held long talks with us on a great diversity of subjects. His father came and sat with him, and went again. And still there was no reference to the late tragedy, or to the former troubles which had brought it on. Did he remember, and conceal his dreadful knowledge? Or was the whole blotted from his mind? This was the problem that kept us watching and trembling all day, when we were in his company, and held us awake at night when we were in our lonely beds. We knew not even which alternative to hope for, both appearing so unnatural, and pointing so directly to an unsound brain. Once this fear offered, I observed his conduct with sedulous particularity. Something of the child he exhibited, a cheerfulness quite foreign to his previous character, an interest readily aroused, and then very tenacious in small matters which he had heretofore despised. When he was stricken down, I was his only confidant, and I may say his only friend, and he was on terms of division with his wife. Upon his recovery, all was changed, the past forgotten, the wife first, and even single in his thoughts. he turned to her with all his emotions like a child to its mother, and seemed secure of sympathy, called her in all his needs with something of that querulous familiarity that marks a certainty of indulgence. And I must say, in justice to the woman, he was never disappointed. To her, indeed, this changed behaviour was inexpressibly affecting, and I think she felt it secretly as a reproach, so that I have seen her in early days escape out of the room that she might indulge herself in weeping. But to me the change appeared not natural, and viewing it along with all the rest, I began to wonder, with many head-shakings, whether his reason were perfectly erect. As this doubt stretched over many years, endured, indeed, until my master's death, and clouded all our subsequent relations, I may well consider of it more at large. When he was able to resume some charge of his affairs, I had many opportunities to try him with precision. There was no lack of understanding, nor yet of authority, but the old continuous interest had quite departed. He grew readily fatigued, and fell to yawning, and he carried into money relations, where it is certainly out of place, a facility that bordered upon slackness. True, since we had no longer the exactions of the master to contend against, there was the less occasion to raise strictness into principle, or do battle for a farthing. True again, there was nothing excessive in these relaxations, or I would have been no party to them. But the whole thing marked a change, very slight, yet very perceptible, and though no man could say my master had gone at all out of his mind, no man could deny that he had drifted from his character. It was the same to the end with his manner and appearance. Some of the heat of the fever lingered in his veins, his movements a little hurried, his speech notably more voluble, yet neither truly amiss. His whole mind stood open to happy impressions, welcoming these and making much of them. But the smallest suggestion of trouble or sorrow he received with visible impatience, and dismissed again with immediate relief. It was to this temper that he owed the felicity of his latter days. And yet here it was, if anywhere, that you could call the man insane. A great part of this life consists in contemplating what we cannot cure. But Mr. Henry, if he could not dismiss solicitude by an effort of the mind, must instantly, and at whatever cost, annihilate the cause of it, so that he played alternately the ostrich and the bull. It is to this strenuous cowardice of pain that I have to set down all the unfortunate and excessive steps of his subsequent career. Certainly this was the reason of his beating Manus, the groom, a thing so much out of all his former practice, and which awakened so much comment at the time. It is to this again that I must lay the total loss of near upon £200, more than the half of which I could have saved, if his impatience would have suffered me. But he preferred loss, or any desperate extreme, to a continuance of mental suffering. All this has led me far from our immediate trouble, whether he remembered or had forgotten his late dreadful act, and if he remembered, in what light he viewed it. The truth burst upon us suddenly, and was indeed one of the chief surprises of my life. He had been several times abroad, and was now beginning to walk a little with an arm, when it chanced I should be left alone with him upon the terrace. He turned to me with a singular furtive smile, such as schoolboys use when in fault, and, says he, in a private whisper, and without the least preface, "Where have you buried him?" I could not make one sound in answer. "Where have you buried him?" he repeated. "I want to see his grave." I conceived I had best take the bull by the horns. "Mr. Henry," said I have news to give that will rejoice you exceedingly. In all human likelihood your hands are clear of blood. I reason from certain indices, and by these it should appear your brother was not dead, but was carried in a swound on board the lugger. But now he may be perfectly recovered. What there was in his countenance I could not read. "James?" he asked. "Your brother James," I answered. "I would not raise a hope that may be found deceptive, but in my heart I think it very probable he is alive." "Ah," says Mr. Henry, and suddenly rising from his seat with more alacrity than he had yet discovered, set one finger on my breast, and cried at me in a kind of screaming whisper, "Mackellar!" These were his words. "Nothing can kill that man. He is not mortal. He is bound upon my back to all eternity, to all God's eternity," says he, and sitting down again, fell upon a stubborn silence. A day or two after, with the same secret smile, and first looking about as if to be sure we were alone, "Mackellar," said he, "when you have any intelligence, be sure and let me know. We must keep an eye upon him, or he will take us when we least expect." "He will not show his face here again," said I. "Oh, yes, he will," said Mr. Henry. "Wherever I am, there will he be." And again he looked all about him. "You must not dwell upon this thought, Mr. Henry," said I. "No," said he, "that is very good advice. We will never think of it, except when you have news. And we do not know yet," he added. "He may be dead." The manner of his saying this convinced me thoroughly of what I had scarce ventured to suspect, that, so far from suffering any penitence for the attempt, he did but lament his failure. This was a discovery I kept to myself, fearing it might do him a prejudice with his wife. But I might have saved myself the trouble. She had divined it for herself, and found the sentiment quite natural. Indeed, I could not but say that there were three of us, all of the same mind. Nor could any news have reached Durrisdeer more generally welcome than tidings of the Master's death. This brings me to speak of the exception, my old lord. As soon as my anxiety for my own master began to be relaxed, I was aware of a change in the old gentleman his father that seemed to threaten mortal consequences. His face was pale and swollen. As he sat in the chimney side with his Latin, he would drop off sleeping, and the book roll in the ashes. Some days he would drag his foot, others stumble in speaking. The amenity of his behaviour appeared more extreme, full of excuses for the least trouble, very thoughtful for all, to myself of a most flattering civility. One day, that he had sent for his lawyer and remained a long while private, he met me as he was crossing the hall with painful footsteps, and took me kindly by the hand. "Mr. Mackellar," said he, "I have had many occasions to set a proper value on your services; and to-day, when I recast my will, I have taken the freedom to name you for one of my executors. I believe you bear love enough to our house to render me this service." At that very time he passed the greater portion of his days in slumber, from which it was often difficult to rouse him; seemed to have lost all count of years, and had several times, particularly on waking, called for his wife, and for an old servant whose very gravestone was now green with moss. If I had been put to my oath, I must have declared he was incapable of testing; and yet there was never a will drawn more sensible in every trait, or showing a more excellent judgment both of persons and affairs. His dissolution, though it took not very long, proceeded by infinitesimal gradations. His faculties decayed together steadily. The power of his limbs was almost gone. He was extremely deaf. His speech had sunk into mere mumblings, and yet, to the end, he managed to discover something of his former courtesy and kindness, pressing the hand of any that helped him, presenting me with one of his Latin books, in which he had laboriously traced my name, and in 1,000 ways reminding us of the greatness of that loss which it might almost be said we had already suffered. To the end, the power of articulation returned to him in flashes. It seemed he had only forgotten the art of speech as a child forgets his lesson, and at times he would call some part of it to mind. On the last night of his life he suddenly broke silence with these words from Virgil: Natique patrisque alma precor miserere, perfectly uttered, and with a fitting accent. At the sudden clear sound of it we started from our several occupations, but it was in vain we turned to him. He sat there, silent, and, to all appearance, fatuous. A little later he was had to bed with more difficulty than ever before, and some time in the night, without any mortal violence, his spirit fled. At a far later period I chanced to speak of these particulars with a doctor of medicine, a man of so high a reputation that I scruple to adduce his name. By his view of it, father and son both suffered from the same affection: the father from the strain of his unnatural sorrows, the son perhaps in the excitation of the fever. Each had ruptured a vessel in the brain, and there was probably, my doctor added, some predisposition in the family to accidents of that description. The father sank, the son recovered all the externals of a healthy man, but it is like there was some destruction in those delicate tissues where the soul resides and does her earthly business. Her heavenly, I would fain hope, cannot be thus obstructed by material accidents. And yet, upon a more mature opinion, it matters not one jot. For he who shall pass judgment on the records of our life is the same that formed us in frailty. The death of my old lord was the occasion of a fresh surprise to us who watched the behaviour of his successor. To any considering mind, the two sons had between them slain their father, and he who took the sword might even be said to have slain him with his hand. But no such thought appeared to trouble my new lord. He was becomingly grave. I could scarce say sorrowful, or only with a pleasant sorrow, talking of the dead with a regretful cheerfulness, relating old examples of his character, smiling at them with a good conscience, and when the day of the funeral came round, doing the honours with exact propriety. I could perceive, besides, that he found a solid gratification in his accession to the title, the which he was punctilious in exacting. And now there came upon the scene a new character, and one that played his part too in the story. I mean the present lord, Alexander, whose birth, 17th July 1757, filled the cup of my poor master's happiness. There was nothing then left him to wish for, nor yet leisure for him to wish for it. Indeed, there never was a parent so fond and doting as he showed himself. He was continually uneasy in his son's absence. Was the child abroad? The father would be watching the clouds in case it rained. Was it night? He would rise out of his bed to observe its slumbers. His conversation grew even weariful to strangers, since he talked of little but his son. In matters relating to the estate, all was designed with a particular eye to Alexander, and it would be, "Let us put it in hand at once, that the wood may be grown against Alexander's majority," or "This will fall in again handsomely for Alexander's marriage." Every day this absorption of the man's nature became more observable, with many touching and some very blameworthy particulars. Soon the child could walk abroad with him, at first on the terrace, hand in hand, and afterward at large about the policies. And this grew to be my lord's chief occupation. The sound of their two voices, audible a great way off, for they spoke loud, became familiar in the neighbourhood, and for my part I found it more agreeable than the sound of birds. It was pretty to see the pair returning, full of briars, and the father as flushed, and sometimes as bemuddied, as the child; for they were equal sharers in all sorts of boyish entertainment, digging in the beach, damming of streams, and what not. And I have seen them gaze through a fence at cattle with the same childish contemplation. The mention of these rambles brings me to a strange scene of which I was a witness. There was one walk I never followed myself without emotion. So often had I gone there upon miserable errands, so much had there befallen against the house of Durrisdeer. But the path lay handy from all points beyond the Mucklegross, and I was driven, although much against my will, to take my use of it perhaps once in the 2 months. It befell, when Master Alexander was of the age of 6 or 7, I had some business on the far side in the morning, and entered the shrubbery on my homeward way about 9 of a bright forenoon. It was that time of year when the woods are all in their spring colours, the thorns all in flower, and the birds in the high season of their singing. In contrast to this merriment, the shrubbery was only the more sad, and I the more oppressed by its associations. In this situation of spirit it struck me disagreeably to hear voices a little way in front, and to recognise the tones of my lord and Master Alexander. I pushed ahead, and came presently into their view. They stood together in the open space where the duel was, my lord with his hand on his son's shoulder, and speaking with some gravity. At least, as he raised his head upon my coming, I thought I could perceive his countenance to lighten. "Ah," says he, "here comes the good Mackellar. I have just been telling Sandy the story of this place, and how there was a man whom the devil tried to kill, and how near he came to kill the devil instead." I had thought it strange enough he should bring the child into that scene, that he should actually be discoursing of his act, past measure. But the worst was yet to come, for he added, turning to his son, "You can ask Mackellar. He was here and saw it." "Did you really see the devil?" asked the child. "I have not heard the tale," I replied, "and I am in a press of business." So far, I said sourly, fencing with the embarrassment of the position; and suddenly the bitterness of the past and the terror of that scene by candlelight rushed in upon my mind. I bethought me that, for a difference of a second's quickness in parade, the child before me might have never seen the day, and the emotion that always fluttered round my heart in that dark shrubbery burst forth in words. "But so much is true," I cried, "that I have met the devil in these woods, and seen him foiled here. Blessed be God that we escaped with life. Blessed be God that one stone yet stands upon another in the walls of Durrisdeer. And, O Master Alexander, if ever you come by this spot, though it was 100 years hence, and you came with the gayest and the highest in the land, I would step aside and remember a bit prayer." My lord bowed his head gravely. "Ah," says he, "Mackellar is always in the right. Come, Alexander, take your bonnet off." And with that he uncovered and held out his hand. "O Lord," said he, "I thank thee, and my son thanks thee, for thy manifold great mercies. Let us have peace for a little. Defend us from the evil man. Smite him, O Lord, upon the lying mouth." The last broke out of him like a cry, and at that, whether remembered anger choked his utterance, or whether he perceived this was a singular sort of prayer, at least he suddenly came to a full stop, and after a moment set back his hat upon his head. "I think you have forgot a word, my lord," said I. "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen." "Ah, that is easy saying," said my lord. "That is very easy saying, Mackellar. But for me to forgive, I think I would cut a very silly figure, if I had the affectation to pretend it." "The bairn, my lord," said I, with some severity, for I thought his expressions little fitted for the ears of children. "Why, very true," said he. "This is dull work for a bairn. Let's go nesting." I forget if it was the same day, but it was soon after, my lord, finding me alone, opened himself a little more on the same head. "Mackellar," he said, "I am now a very happy man." "I think so indeed, my lord," said I, "and the sight of it gives me a light heart." "There is an obligation in happiness. Do you not think so?" says he, musingly. "I think so indeed," says I, "and one in sorrow too. If we are not here to try to do the best, in my humble opinion, the sooner we are away, the better for all parties." "Ay, but if you were in my shoes, would you forgive him?" asks my lord. The suddenness of the attack a little gravelled me. "It is a duty laid upon us strictly," said I. "Hut!" said he, "these are expressions. Do you forgive the man yourself?" "Well, no," said I. "God forgive me, I do not." "Shake hands upon that," cries my lord, with a kind of joviality. "It is an ill sentiment to shake hands upon," said I, "for Christian people. I think I will give you mine on some more evangelical occasion." This I said smiling a little, but as for my lord, he went from the room laughing aloud. For my lord's slavery to the child I can find no expression adequate. He lost himself in that continual thought, business, friends, and wife being all alike forgotten, or only remembered with a painful effort, like that of one struggling with a posset. It was most notable in the matter of his wife. Since I had known Durrisdeer, she had been the burthen of his thought and the lodestone of his eyes, and now she was quite cast out. I have seen him come to the door of a room, look round, and pass my lady over as though she were a dog before the fire. It would be Alexander he was seeking, and my lady knew it well. I have heard him speak to her so ruggedly that I nearly found it in my heart to intervene. The cause would still be the same, that she had in some way thwarted Alexander. Without doubt this was in the nature of a judgment on my lady. Without doubt she had the tables turned upon her, as only Providence can do it. She, who had been cold so many years to every mark of tenderness, it was her part now to be neglected. An odd situation resulted, that we had once more two parties in the house, and that I now was of my lady's. Not that I ever lost the love I bore my master, but, for one thing, he had the less use for my society. For another, I could not but compare the case of Master Alexander with that of Miss Catherine, for whom my lord had never found the least attention. And for a third, I was wounded by the change he discovered to his wife, which struck me in the nature of an infidelity. I could not but admire, besides, the constancy and kindness she displayed. Perhaps her sentiment to my lord, as it had been founded from the first in pity, was that rather of a mother than a wife. Perhaps it pleased her, if I may say so, to behold her two children so happy in each other, the more as the one had suffered so unjustly in the past. But for all that, and though I could never trace in her one spark of jealousy, she must fall back for society on poor neglected Miss Catherine, and I, on my part, came to pass my spare hours more and more with the mother and daughter. It would be easy to make too much of this division, for it was a pleasant family, as families go. Still the thing existed. Whether my lord knew it or not, I am in doubt. I do not think he did. He was bound up so entirely in his son. But the rest of us knew it, and in a manner suffered from the knowledge. What troubled us most, however, was the great and growing danger to the child. My lord was his father over again. It was to be feared the son would prove a second master. Time has proved these fears to have been quite exaggerate. Certainly there is no more worthy gentleman to-day in Scotland, than the 7th Lord Durrisdeer. Of my own exodus from his employment it does not become me to speak, above all in a memorandum written only to justify his father. Editor's note. 5 pages of Mr. Mackellar's manuscript are here omitted. I have gathered from their perusal an impression that Mr. Mackellar, in his old age, was rather an exacting servant. Against the 7th Lord Durrisdeer, with whom at any rate we have no concern, nothing material is alleged. R.L.S. But our fear at the time was lest he should turn out in the person of his son a second edition of his brother. My lady had tried to interject some wholesome discipline. She had been glad to give that up, and now looked on with secret dismay. Sometimes she even spoke of it by hints, and sometimes, when there was brought to her knowledge some monstrous instance of my lord's indulgence, she would betray herself in a gesture, or perhaps an exclamation. As for myself, I was haunted by the thought both day and night, not so much for the child's sake as for the father's. The man had gone to sleep. He was dreaming a dream, and any rough awakening must infallibly prove mortal. That he should survive the child's death was inconceivable, and the fear of its dishonour made me cover my face. It was this continual preoccupation that screwed me up at last to a remonstrance, a matter worthy to be narrated in detail. My lord and I sat one day at the same table upon some tedious business of detail. I have said that he had lost his former interest in such occupations. He was plainly itching to be gone, and he looked fretful, weary, and methought older than I had ever previously observed. I suppose it was the haggard face that put me suddenly upon my enterprise. "My lord," said I, with my head down, and feigning to continue my occupation, "or rather let me call you again by the name of Mr. Henry, for I fear your anger, and want you to think upon old times." "My good Mackellar," said he, and that in tone so kindly that I had near forsook my purpose. But I called to mind that I was speaking for his good, and stuck to my colours. "Has it never come in upon your mind what you are doing?" I asked. "What I am doing?" he repeated. I was never good at guessing riddles. "What you are doing with your son," said I. "Well," said he, with some defiance in his tone, "and what am I doing with my son?" "Your father was a very good man," says I, straying from the direct path. "But do you think he was a wise father?" There was a pause before he spoke, and then, "I say nothing against him," he replied. "I had the most cause, perhaps, but I say nothing." "Why, there it is," said I. "You had the cause at least. And yet your father was a good man. I never knew a better, save on the one point, nor yet a wiser. Where he stumbled, it is highly possible another man should fall. He had 2 sons." My lord rapped suddenly and violently on the table. "What is this?" cried he. "Speak out." "I will then," said I, my voice almost strangled with the thumping of my heart. "If you continue to indulge Master Alexander, you are following in your father's footsteps. Beware, my lord, lest, when he grows up, your son should follow in the master's." I had never meant to put the thing so crudely, but in the extreme of fear there comes a brutal kind of courage, the most brutal indeed of all, and I burnt my ships with that plain word. I never had the answer. When I lifted my head, my lord had risen to his feet, and the next moment he fell heavily on the floor. The fit or seizure endured not very long. He came to himself vacantly, put his hand to his head, which I was then supporting, and, says he in a broken voice, "I have been ill," and a little after, "Help me." I got him to his feet, and he stood pretty well, though he kept hold of the table. "I have been ill, Mackellar," he said again. "Something broke, Mackellar, or was going to break, and then all swam away. I think I was very angry. Never you mind, Mackellar, never you mind, my man. I wouldna hurt a hair upon your head. Too much has come and gone. It's a certain thing between us two. But I think, Mackellar, I will go to Mrs. Henry. I think I will go to Mrs. Henry, said he, and got pretty steadily from the room, leaving me overcome with penitence. Presently the door flew open, and my lady swept in with flashing eyes. "What is all this?" she cried. "What have you done to my husband? Will nothing teach you your position in this house? Will you never cease from making and meddling?" "My lady," said I, "since I have been in this house I have had plenty of hard words. For a while they were my daily diet, and I swallowed them all. As for to-day, you may call me what you please. You will never find the name hard enough for such a blunder. And yet I meant it for the best." I told her all with ingenuity, even as it is written here. And when she had heard me out, she pondered, and I could see her animosity fall. "Yes," she said, "you meant well indeed. I have had the same thought myself, or the same temptation rather, which makes me pardon you. But, dear God, can you not understand that he can bear no more? He can bear no more," she cried. "The cord is stretched to snapping. What matters the future, if he have 1 or 2 good days?" "Amen," said I will meddle no more. I am pleased enough that you should recognise the kindness of my meaning." "Yes," said my lady, "but when it came to the point, I have to suppose your courage failed you, for what you said was said cruelly." She paused, looking at me, then suddenly smiled a little, and said a singular thing. "Do you know what you are, Mr. Mackellar? You are an old maid." No more incident of any note occurred in the family until the return of that ill-starred man, the master. But I have to place here a second extract from the Memoirs of Chevalier Burke, interesting in itself, and highly necessary for my purpose. It is our only sight of the master on his Indian travels, and the first word in these pages of Secundra Das. One fact, it is to observe, appears here very clearly, which, if we had known some 20 years ago, how many calamities and sorrows had been spared, that Secundra Das spoke English. End of chapter 6. Recording by Thomas Copeland.